Welcome back to Major Antonio's presentation of Out of My Life by Marshal Paul von Hindenburg. We present this audiobook in 24 parts. Subscribe to our channel so as not to miss anything. Part 2, The Campaign in the East. Chapter 5, The Struggle for East Prussia. 1. The Outbreak of War and My Recall.
The unruffled course of my life after the year 1911 gave me a chance to devote my spare time to following political events in the world. What I thus saw was not indeed of a nature likely to fill me with satisfaction. I was not in the least anxious, but I could not get rid of a certain oppressive feeling. I was in a sense forced to the conclusion that we were venturing into the distant ocean of world politics before our foundations in Europe itself had been sufficiently secured. Whether the political storm clouds hung over Morocco or gathered over the Balkans, I shared with the majority of my countrymen a vague feeling that our German foundations were being undermined. In recent years, we had unquestionably been in the presence of one of those chauvinistic waves which seemed to recur at regular intervals in France. Their origin was known. They found their support in Russia or England, or both, quite indifferent to who or what was the open or secret, known or unknown driving force there. I have never ignored the special difficulties with which German foreign policy has been faced, the dangers involved in our geographical situation, our economic necessities, and last, but not least, our frontier provinces with their mixed nationalities, stared us in the face. The policy of our enemies, which succeeded in reconciling all their jealousies against us, did not, in my opinion, require a high degree of skill. In the long run, it was mainly responsible for the war. We neglected to make preparations to meet that danger. From the point of view of procuring allies, our policy seemed to be inspired more by a code of honor than a proper regard for the needs of our people and our world situation. When even in the 90s, a subsequent German chancellor considered he had to regard the progressive decay of the Danube monarchy, our ally, as obvious it is inconceivable that our statesmen should not have drawn the appropriate inferences. I have always had the liveliest sympathy with the German-Austrian members of our race. All of us have thoroughly understood the difficulties of their position in their fatherland. But in my opinion, this feeling of ours was exploited far too freely by Austro-Hungarian politicians. The Nibelung Compact was certainly solemn enough at the time it was made. It could not, however, blind us to the fact that in the Bosnian crisis, the occasion on which the phrase was coined, Austria-Hungary had precipitately dragged us after her, without that previous understanding due to an ally, and then summoned us to cover her rear. It was clear that we could not abandon our allies at that juncture. It would simply have meant that we strengthened the Russian colossus, with the prospect of being crushed by it all the more certainly and irresistibly in the long run. To me, as a soldier, the contrast between Austria-Hungary's political claims and her domestic and military resources was particularly striking. To meet the huge armaments with which Russia had restored her position after the war in Eastern Asia, we Germans had certainly increased our defenses, but we had not required the same measures of our Austro-Hungarian allies. It may have been a simple matter for the statesmen of the Danube monarchy to meet all our suggestions for the increase of Austro-Hungarian armaments with a recital of their domestic difficulties. But how was it that we found no means of presenting Austria-Hungary with a definite alternative in this matter? We already knew of the enormous numerical superiority of our prospective enemies. Ought we to have permitted our allies to make no use of a large part of their national resources available for the common defense? What advantage was it for us to have Austria-Hungary as a bulwark far to the southeast, when this bulwark was cracked at points innumerable and did not dispose of enough defenders to man its walls? From the earliest times, it seemed to me doubtful to rely on any effective help from Italy. It was an uncertain quantity, questionable even if the Italian statesmen favored the idea. We had had an excellent opportunity of realizing the weaknesses of the Italian army in the war in Tripoli. Since that war, the situation of Italy had improved but little, thanks to the shaky condition of its finances. In any case, it was not ready to strike. It was along such lines that my thoughts and anxieties moved in those years. I had already had 2 personal experiences of war, on both occasions under strong and resolute political leadership, combined with clear and straightforward military objectives. I was not afraid of war. I am not afraid of it now. But besides its uplifting influence, I knew its wholesale encroachment upon every side of human activity too well not to wish that it should be avoided as long as possible. And now the war was upon us. The hopelessness of our prospects of compromising with France on the basis of the status quo, soothing England's commercial jealousy and fear of rivalry, and satisfying Russia's greed without breaking faith with our Austrian ally, had long created a feeling of tension in Germany, compared with which the outbreak of war was felt almost as a release from a perpetual burden we had carried all our lives. Then came the imperial summons to arms, and with it a proud army of whose efficiency the world had seldom seen the like. The hearts of the whole nation must have beat faster at the very sight of it, yet there was no vainglorious boasting in view of the task which faced it. As neither Bismarck nor Moltke had left us in any doubt as to what such a war would mean, every intelligent man asked himself whether we should be in a position to hold out, politically, economically, and morally, as well as in a military sense. But confidence was unquestionably stronger than doubt. The news of the bursting of the storm broke in upon this train of thought and reflection. The soldier within me sprang to life again and dominated everything else. Would my emperor and king need me? Exactly a year had passed without my receiving any official intimation of this kind. Enough younger men seemed available. I put myself in the hands of fate and waited in longing expectation.
2. To the front.
The homeland listened in suspense. The news from the various theaters of war realized our hopes and wishes. Liege had fallen, the action at Mulhausen had come to a victorious conclusion, and our right wing and center were passing through Belgium. The first news of the victory in Lorraine was just reaching the country, rejoicing all hearts. In the east, too, the trumpets of victory were sounding. Nowhere had anything happened which seemed to justify any anxiety. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon of August 22nd, I received an inquiry from the headquarters of His Majesty, the Emperor, as to whether I was prepared for immediate employment. My answer ran, "I am ready." Even before this telegram could have reached main headquarters, I received another. It was to the effect that my willingness to accept a post in the field was assumed as a matter of course, and informed me that General Ludendorff was to be assigned to me. Further telegrams from main headquarters explained that I was to leave for the east immediately to take command of an army. About 3 o'clock in the morning, I went to the station, imperfectly equipped, as time had been short, and waited expectantly in the well-lit hall. It was only when the short special train steamed in that I wrenched my thoughts away from the hearth and home which I had had to leave so suddenly. General Ludendorff stepped briskly from the train and reported as my chief of staff of the 8th Army. Before that moment, the general had been a stranger to me, and I had not yet heard of his feats at Liege. He first explained the situation on the Eastern Front to me as communicated to him on August 22nd at main headquarters, Koblenz, by Colonel General von Moltke, Chief of the General Staff. It appeared that the operations of the 8th Army in East Prussia had taken the following course. At the opening of hostilities, the army had left the 20th Army Corps, strengthened by fortress garrisons and other landwehr formations, in a position covering the southern frontier of East and West Prussia from the Vistula to the Lotsen Lakes. The main body of the army, 1st and 17th Army Corps, 1st Reserve Corps, 3rd Reserve Division, the garrison of Königsberg, and the 1st Cavalry Division, had been concentrated on the eastern frontier of East Prussia, and had there attacked the Russian Niemann Army, which was advancing under General Rennenkampf. There had been an action at Stallupönen on August 17th, and another at Gumbinnen on the 19th and 20th. During the battle at Gumbinnen, news had been received of the approach of the Russian Naru Army under General Samsonov towards the German frontier between Soldau and Willenburg. The commander of our 8th Army had therefore reason to expect that the Russians would have crossed that stretch of the frontier by the 20th. In view of this threat to their communications from the south, the headquarters staff broke off the action at Gumbinnen and reported to main headquarters that they were not in a position to hold the country east of the Vistula any longer. General von Moltke had not approved of that decision. It was his opinion that an attempt must be made to destroy the Naro army before we could think of abandoning East Prussia, so important from the military, economic, and political point of view. The conflict between the views of main headquarters and those of the Army headquarters staff had necessitated a change in the command of the Eighth Army. At the moment, the situation of this army appeared to be as follows. It had successfully shaken off the enemy. The 1st Army Corps and the 3rd Reserve Division were moving west by rail, while the 1st Reserve Corps and the 17th Army Corps were marching for the line of the Vistula. The 20th Army Corps was still in its positions on the frontier. Before long, I and my new Chief of Staff were at one in our view of the situation. Even while at Koblenz, General Ludendorff had been able to issue such preliminary orders as brooked no delay, orders intended to secure the continuance of operations east of the Vistula. The most important of these was that the 1st Army Corps should not be brought too far west, but directed on Deutsch Eylau, that is towards the enemy and behind the right wing of the 20th Corps. Everything else must and could be left for decision when we reached Army headquarters at Marienburg. Our conference had taken scarcely more than half an hour. We then went to bed. I made thoroughly good use of the time at my disposal. We thus traveled together towards a joint future, fully conscious how serious the situation was, and yet with perfect confidence in our Lord God, our brave troops, and last but not least, in one another. From now on, we were to be united for years in common thought and action. At this point, I may well say something about my relations with General Ludendorff, then Chief of Staff, and subsequently First Quartermaster General. It has been suggested that these relations find a parallel in those between Blücher and Gneisenau. I will venture no opinion as to how far such a comparison reveals a departure from true historical perspective. As I have already said, I had myself held the post of Chief of Staff for several years. As I knew from my own experience, the relations between the Chief of Staff and his general, who has the responsibility, are not theoretically laid down in the German army. The way in which they work together and the degree to which their powers are complementary are much more a matter of personality. The boundaries of their respective powers are therefore not clearly demarcated. If the relations between the general and his Chief of Staff are what they ought to be, these boundaries are easily adjusted by soldierly and personal tact and the qualities of mind on both sides. I myself have often characterized my relations with General Ludendorff as those of a happy marriage. In such a relationship, how can a third partly clearly distinguish the merits of the individuals? They are one in thought and action, and often what the one says is only the expression of the wishes and feelings of the other. After I had learnt the worth of General Ludendorff, and that was soon, I realized that one of my principal tasks was, as far as possible, to give free scope to the intellectual powers, the almost superhuman capacity for work and untiring resolution of my Chief of Staff, and if necessary, clear the way for him, the way in which our common desires and our common goal pointed, victory for our colors, the welfare of our fatherland, and a peace worthy of the sacrifices our nation had made. I had to show General Ludendorff that loyalty of a brother warrior which we had learnt to find in German history from youth up, that loyalty in which our ethical philosophy is so rich. And indeed his work and his determination, his whole great personality, were truly worthy of such loyalty. Others may think what they like. For him, as for so many of our great and greatest men, the time will come one day when the whole nation will look to him in admiration. I can only hope that in an equally critical hour of trial our fatherland may find such a man again, a man who is every bit a man, a host in himself, unapproachable and uncompromising indeed, but created for a gigantic task if anyone ever was. See how he was hated by his enemies, who rightly knew his worth. The harmony of our military and political convictions formed the basis for our joint views as to the proper use of our resources. Differences of opinion were easily reconciled, without our relations being disturbed by a feeling of forced submission on either side. The hard work of my chief of staff translated our thoughts and plans into action at our army headquarters and later at main headquarters, when the responsibilities of that post were entrusted to us. His influence inspired everyone, and no one could escape it without running the risk of finding himself off the common path. How otherwise could the enormous task have been done and full effect given to the driving force? Around us too gathered the wider circle of our colleagues, filled with a resolute soldierly sense of duty and well endowed with ideas. A feeling of deep thankfulness possesses me whenever I think of them.
3. Tannenberg.
Early in the afternoon of August 23rd, we reached our headquarters at Marienburg. We thus entered the region east of the Vistula, which was to form the immediate theater of our operations. At this moment, the situation at the front had undergone the following development. The 20th Corps had been withdrawn from its positions on the frontier by Hindenburg to Gilgenberg and east of it. In touch with this corps on the west, the garrisons of the fortresses of Thorn and Graudenz were along the frontier as far as the Vistula. The 3rd Division had arrived at Allenstein as a reinforcement for the 20th Army Corps. After considerable delay, the entrainment of the 1st Army Corps for Deutsch Eylau had begun. The 17th Corps and the 1st Reserve Corps had reached the neighborhood of Gerdauen on foot. The 1st Cavalry Division was south of Insterburg, facing Rennenkampf's army. The garrison of Königsberg had passed through Insterburg in its retreat to the west. With a few exceptions, there were no noteworthy bodies of infantry of Rennenkampf's Niemann army on the west side of the Angerap. Of the 2 Russian cavalry corps, one was reported close to Angerburg, the other west of Darkemen. Of Samsonov's Neru army, apparently 1 division had reached the neighborhood of Ortelsburg, while Johannesburg was said to be in the enemy's possession. For the rest, the main body of this army seemed to be still concentrating on the frontier with its western wing at Mlawa. In the pocketbook of a dead Russian officer, a note had been found which revealed the intention of the enemy command. It told us that Rennenkampf's army was to pass the Masurian lakes on the north and advance against the Insterburg-Angerburg line. It was to attack the German forces presumed to be behind the Angerap, while the Narrow army was to cross the Lützen-Ortelsburg line to take the Germans in flank. The Russians were thus planning a concentric attack against the 8th Army, but Samsonov's army now already extended farther west than was originally intended. What indeed could we do to meet this dangerous enemy scheme? It was dangerous less on account of the audacity of the conception than by reason of the strength in which it was to be carried out. At any rate, strength from the point of view of numbers. We could hope that it would be otherwise as regards strength of will. During the months of August and September, Russia brought up no fewer than 800,000 men and 1,700 guns against East Prussia, for the defense of which we had only 210,000 German soldiers and 600 guns at our disposal. Our countermeasures were simple. I will attempt to make the broad outlines of our plan clear to the reader, even if he is not an expert. In the first place, we opposed a thin center to Samsonov's solid mass. I say thin, not weak, for it was composed of men with hearts and wills of steel. Behind them were their homes, wives and children, parents and relatives, and everything they had. It was the 20th Corps, brave East and West Prussians. This thin center might bend under the enemy's pressure, but it would not break. While this center was engaged, 2 important groups on its wings were to carry out the decisive attack. The troops of the 1st Corps, reinforced by Landwehr, likewise sons of the threatened region, were brought for the battle from the right, the northwest, the troops of the 17th Corps and the 1st Reserve Corps, with a Landwehr brigade, from the left, the north and northeast. These men of the 17th Corps and 1st Reserve Corps, as well as the Landwehr and Landsturm, also had behind them everything which made life worth living. We had not merely to win a victory over Samsonov. We had to annihilate him. Only thus could we get a free hand to deal with the second enemy, Rennenkampf, who was even then plundering and burning East Prussia. Only thus could we really and completely free our old Prussian land and be in a position to do something else which was expected of us. Intervene in the mighty battle for a decision which was raging between Russia and our Austro-Hungarian ally in Galicia and Poland. If this first blow were not final, the danger for our homeland would become like a lingering disease. The burnings and murders in East Prussia would remain unavenged, and our allies in the south would wait for us in vain. It was thus a case for complete measures. Everything must be thrown in, which could prove of the slightest use in maneuver warfare, and could it all be spared. The fortresses of Graudenz and Thorn disgorged yet more landwehr fit for the field. Moreover, our landwehr came from the trenches between the Masurian lakes, which were covering our new operations in the east, and handed over the defense there to a smaller and diminishing number of Landsturm. Once we had won the battle in the field, we should no longer need the fortresses of Thorn and Graudenz, and should be freed from anxieties as regards the defiles between the lakes. Our cavalry division and the Königsberg garrison with 2 Landwehr brigades were to remain facing Rennenkampf, who might fall upon us like an avalanche from the northeast at any time. But at the moment we could not yet say whether these forces would really be sufficient. They formed but a light veil which would easily be torn if Rennenkampf's main columns moved or his innumerable cavalry squadrons advanced, as we had to fear. But perhaps they would not move. In that case, the veil would be enough to cover our weakness. We had to take risks on our flanks and rear if we were to be strong at the decisive point. We hoped we might succeed in deceiving Rennenkampf. Perhaps he would deceive himself. The strong fortress of Königsberg with its garrison and our cavalry might assume the proportions of a mighty force in the imagination of the enemy. But even supposing Rennenkampf cradled himself in illusions to our advantage, would not his high command urge him forward in forced marches to the southwest, in our rear? Would not Samsonov's cry for help bring him in hot haste to the battlefield? And even if the sound of human voices echoed in vain, would not the warning thunder of the battle reach the Russian lines north of the lakes, nay, to the enemy's headquarters itself? Caution with regard to Rennenkampf was therefore necessary, though we could not carry it to the extent of leaving strong forces behind, or we should find ourselves weaker on the battlefield than we ought to be. When we considered the numbers on both sides, a comparison with the probable Russian forces showed a great disparity against us. Even if we counted in on our side the 2 Landwehr brigades, which were then coming from Schleswig-Holstein, where they had been employed in coast protection, and assuming that they would arrive in time for the battle, and even if Rennenkampf did not move, and indeed played no part. Moreover, it must be remembered that large bodies of Landwehr and Landsturm had to fight in the first line, older classes against the pick of Russia's youth. We had the further disadvantage that most of our troops, and as the situation decreed, all those which had to deliver the coup de grace, had just been engaged in heavy and expensive fighting. Had they not just been compelled to leave the battlefield of Gumbinnen to the Russians, the troops were not therefore marching with the proud feeling of being victors. Yet they pressed forward to the battle with stout hearts and unshaken confidence. We were told that their moral was good, and it therefore justified bold decisions. Where it was somewhat shaken, such decisions could not fail to restore it. It had been thus before. Could it be otherwise now? I had no misgivings on the score of our numerical inferiority. He who reckons solely by the visible in war is reckoning falsely. The inherent worth of the soldier is everything. It was on that I based my confidence. What I thought to myself was this: the Russian may invade our fatherland, and contact with the soil of Germany may lift up his heart, but that does not make him a German soldier, and those who lead him are not German officers. The Russian soldier had fought with the greatest obedience on the battlefields of Manchuria, although he had no sympathy with the political ambitions of his rulers in the Pacific. It did not seem unlikely that in a war against the Central Powers, the Russian army would have greater enthusiasm for the war aims of the Tsar's empire. On the other hand, I considered that, taking it all round, the Russian soldier and officer would not display higher military qualities in the European theater than they had in the Asiatic, and believed that in comparing the two forces, I was entitled to credit our side with a plus on the ground of intrinsic value instead of a minus for our numerical inferiority. Such was our plan, and such our line of reasoning before and for the battle. We compressed these ideas and intentions into a short report which we sent from Marienburg to main headquarters on August 23rd. Concentration of the army for an enveloping attack in the region of the 20th Corps planned for August 26th. On the evening of the 28th, I took a short walk on the western bank of the Noget. From there, the red walls of the proud castle of the Teutonic Knights, the greatest brick monument of Baltic Gothic, made a truly wonderful picture in the evening light. Thoughts of a noble chivalry of the past mingled involuntarily with conjecture as to the veiled future. The sight of the refugees flying past me from my home province deepened the sense of responsibility that possessed me. It was a melancholy reminder that war not only affects the fighting man, but proves a thousand-fold scourge to humanity by the destruction of the very essentials of existence. On August 24th, I motored with my small staff to the headquarters of the 20th Corps, and thus entered the village which was to give its name to the battle so soon to blaze up. Tannenberg. A word pregnant with painful recollections for German chivalry, a Slav cry of triumph, a name that is fresh in our memories after more than 500 years of history. Before this day, I had never seen the battlefield which proved so fateful to German culture in the East. A simple monument there bore silent witness to the deeds and deaths of heroes. On one of the following days, we stood near this monument while Samsonov's Russian army was going to its doom of sheer annihilation. On our way from Marienburg to Tannenberg, the impression of the miseries into which war had plunged the unhappy inhabitants were intensified. Masses of helpless refugees, carrying their belongings, pressed past me on the road and to a certain extent hindered the movements of our troops which were hastening to meet the foe. Among the staff at the Corps headquarters, I found the confidence and resolution which were essential for the success of our plan. Moreover, they had a favorable opinion of the morale of the troops at this spot, which was at first the crucial point for us. The day brought us no decisive information either about Rennenkampf's operations or Samsonov's movements. Apparently, it only confirmed the fact that Rennenkampf was moving forward very slowly. We could not see the reason for this. Of the Naru army, we knew that its main columns were pressing forward against the 20th Corps. Under its pressure, this corps refused its left wing. There was nothing doubtful about this measure. Quite the contrary. The enemy, following up, would all the more effectively expose his right flank to our left enveloping column, which was marching on Bischofsburg. On the other hand, the hostile movement, which was apparently in progress against our western wing and Lautenburg, attracted our attention, as it caused us some anxiety. We had the impression that the Russians were thinking of enveloping us in turn at this point, and coming in on the flank of our right column as it executed the enveloping movement we projected. August 25th gave us a rather clearer picture of Rennenkampf's movements. His columns were marching from the Angarap, and therefore on Königsberg. Had the original Russian plan been abandoned, or had the Russian leaders been deceived by our movements and suspected that our main force was in and around the fortress? In any case, we must now have not the slightest hesitation in leaving, but a thin screen against Rennenkampf's mighty force. On this day, Samsonov, obviously feeling his way, was directing his main columns towards our 20th Corps. The corps on the Russian right wing was undoubtedly marching on Bischofsburg, and therefore towards our 17th Corps and 1st Reserve Corps, which had reached the district north of this village on this day. Apparently, further large Russian forces were concentrating at Mlawa. This day marked the conclusion of the stage of expectation and preparation. We brought our 1st Corps round to the right wing of the 20th Corps. The general attack could begin. August 26th was the first day of the murderous combat which raged from Lautenburg to north of Bischofsburg. The drama on which the curtain was rising, and whose stage stretched for more than 60 miles, began not with a continuous battle line, but in detached groups, not in one self-contained act, but in a series of scenes. General von Francois was leading his brave East Prussians on the right wing. They pushed forward against Ustau with a view to storming the key to this part of the southern battlefront next day. General von Scholz's magnificent corps gradually shook off the chains of defense and addressed themselves to the business of attack. Fierce was the fighting round Bischofsburg that this day witnessed. By the evening, magnificent work had been done on our side at this point. In a series of powerful blows, the wing corps of Samsonov's right had been defeated and forced to retreat on Ortelsburg by the troops of Mackensen and below, 10th Corps and 1st Reserve Corps, as well as Landwehr. But we could not yet realize how far-reaching our victory had been. The staff expected to have to meet a renewed and stout resistance south of this day's battlefield on the following day. Yet was their confidence high. It was now apparent that danger was threatening from the side of Rennenkampf. It was reported that one of his corps was on the march through Angerburg. Would it not find its way to the rear of our left enveloping force? Moreover, disquieting news came to us from the flank and rear of our western wing. Strong forces of Russian cavalry were in movement away there in the south. We could not find out whether they were being followed up by infantry. The crisis of the battle now approached. One question forced itself upon us. How would the situation develop if these mighty movements and the enemy's superiority in numbers delayed the decision for days? Is it surprising that misgivings filled many a heart, that firm resolution began to yield to vacillation, and that doubts crept in where a clear vision had hitherto prevailed? Would it not be wiser to strengthen our line facing Rennenkampf again and be content with half measures against Samsonov? Was it not better to abandon the idea of destroying the Naru army in order to ensure ourselves against destruction? We overcame the inward crisis, adhered to our original intention, and turned in full strength to effect its realization by attack. So the order was issued for our right wing to advance straight on Neidenberg, and the left enveloping wing to take up its position at 4 a.m. and intervene with the greatest energy. August 27th showed that the victory of the 1st Reserve Corps and 17th Corps at Bischofsburg on the previous day had had far-reaching results. The enemy had not only retired, but was actually fleeing from the battlefield. Moreover, we learned that it was only in the imagination of an airman that Rennenkampf was marching in our rear. The cold truth was that he was slowly pressing on to Königsberg. Did he, or would he not see that Samsonov's right flank was already threatened with utter ruin, and that the danger to his left wing also was increasing from hour to hour? For it was on this day that Francois and Scholz stormed the enemy's lines at and north of Osdau and defeated our southern opponent. Now, when the enemy's center pushed forward farther towards Allenstein-Hohenstein, it was no longer victory but destruction that lured it on. For us, the situation was clear. On the evening of this day, we gave orders for the complete encirclement of the enemy's central mass, his 13th and 15th Corps. The bloody struggle continued to rage on August 28th. On the 29th, a large part of the Russian army saw itself faced with total annihilation at Hohenstein. Ortelsburg was reached from the north, Willenberg through Neidenberg from the west. The ring round thousands and thousands of Russians began to close. Even in this desperate situation, there was plenty of Russian heroism in the cause of the Tsar. Heroism which saved the honor of arms but could no longer save the battle. Meanwhile, Rennenkampf was continuing to march quietly on Königsberg. Samsonov was lost at the very moment when his comrade was to give proof of other and better military qualities. For we were already in a position to draw troops from the battlefront to cover the work of destruction in which we were engaged in the great cauldron, Neidenberg, Willenberg, Passenheim, and in which Samsonov sought for death in his despair. Swelling columns of prisoners poured out of this cauldron. These were the growing proofs of the greatness of our victory. By a freak of fortune, it was in Osterode, one of the villages which we made our headquarters during the battle, that I received one of the 2 captured Russian corps commanders. In the same inn at which I had been quartered during a general staff ride in 1881 when I was a young staff officer. The other reported to me next day at a school which we had converted into an office. As the battle proceeded, we were able to observe what splendid raw material, generally speaking, the Tsar had at his disposal. I had the impression that it doubtless contained many qualities worth training. As in 1866 and 1870, I noticed on this occasion how quickly the German officer and soldier, with their fine feeling and professional tact, forgot the former foe in the helpless captive. The lust of battle in our men quickly ebbed away and changed to deep sympathy and human feeling. It was only against the Cossacks that our men could not contain their rage. They were considered the authors of all the bestial brutalities under which the people and country of East Prussia had suffered so cruelly. The Cossack apparently suffered from a bad conscience, for whenever he saw himself likely to be taken prisoner, he did his best to remove the broad stripe on his trousers, which distinguished his branch of the service. On August 30th, the enemy concentrated fresh troops in the south and east and attempted to break our encircling ring from without. From Masaniec, that is, from the direction of Ostrolenka, he brought up new and strong columns to Hindenburg and Ortelsburg against our troops, which had already completely enveloped the Russian center and were therefore presenting their rear to the new foe. There was danger ahead, all the more so because airmen reported that enemy columns 23 miles long, therefore very strong, were pressing forward from Lawa. Yet we refused to let go of our quarry. Samsonov's main force had to be surrounded and annihilated. Francois and Mackinson sent their reserves, weak reserves, it is true, to meet the new enemy. Against their resistance, the attempt to mitigate the catastrophe to Samsonov came to naught. While despair seized on those within the deadly ring, faint-heartedness paralyzed the energies of those who might have brought their release. In this respect, too, the course of events at the Battle of Tannenberg confirmed the human and military experiences of yore. Our ring of fire round the Russian masses, crowded closely together and swaying this way and that, became closer and narrower with every hour that passed. Rennenkampf appears to have intended to attack the line of the Dima, east of Königsberg and between Labiau and Tapiau this day. From the region of Landsberg and Bartenstein, his masses of cavalry were approaching the battlefield of Tannenberg. However, we had already concentrated strong forces, weary but flushed with victory, for defense in the neighborhood of Allenstein. August 31st was the day of harvesting for such of our troops as were still engaged, a day of deliberation about the further course of operations for our leaders, and for Rennenkampf, the day of the retreat to the Daima-Allenburg-Angerburg line. As early as the 29th, the course of events had enabled me to report the complete collapse of the Russian Narrow Army to my all-highest warlord. The very same day, the thanks of His Majesty in the name of the Fatherland had reached me on the battlefield. I transferred these thanks, in my heart as with my lips, to my Chief of Staff and our splendid troops. On August 31st, I was able to send the following report to my Emperor and King. I beg most humbly to report to Your Majesty that the ring round the larger part of the Russian army was closed yesterday. The 13th, 15th, and 18th Army Corps have been destroyed. We have already taken more than 60,000 prisoners, among them the corps commanders of the 13th and 15th Corps. The guns are still in the forests and are now being brought in. The booty is immense, though it cannot yet be assessed in detail. The corps outside our ring, the 1st and 6th, have also suffered severely and are now retreating in hot haste through Mlawa and Masaniec. The troops and their leaders had accomplished extraordinary feats. The divisions were now in bivouacs, and the hymn of thanks of the Battle of Leuthen rose from their midst. In our new headquarters at Allenstein, I entered the church close by the old castle of the Teutonic Knights, while divine service was being held. As the clergyman uttered his closing words, all those present, young soldiers as well as elderly Landsturm, sank to their knees under the overwhelming impression of their experiences. It was a worthy curtain to their heroic achievements.
4. The Battle of the Masurian Lakes.
The sound of battle on the field of Tannenberg had hardly died down before we had begun to make our preparations for the attack on Rennenkampf's Russian army. On August 31st, we received the following telegraphic instructions from main headquarters. 11th Corps, Guard Reserve Corps, and 8th Cavalry Division are placed at your disposal. Their transport has begun. The first task of the 8th Army is to clear East Prussia of Rennenkampf's army. It is desired that with such troops as you can spare, you should follow up the enemy you have just beaten in the direction of Warsaw, bearing in mind the Russian movements from Warsaw on Silesia. When the situation in East Prussia has been restored, you are to contemplate employing the 8th Army in the direction of Warsaw. These orders were exactly what the situation required. They gave us a clear objective and left the ways and means to us. We considered we had reason to believe that what was left of Samsonov's quondam army was a remnant which had already withdrawn to the shelter of the Naru, or was on its way there. We had to count on its being reinforced, but that could not be for a considerable time. For the moment, it appeared that all that was required was that this remnant should be watched by weak troops along the line of our southern frontier. Everything else must be assembled for the new battle. Even the arrival of the reinforcements from the west did not, in our opinion, enable us to employ forces in striking south over the line of the Naru. It was quite clear what the word Warsaw meant in the second part of the order. In accordance with the plan of joint operations, the armies of Austria-Hungary were to take the offensive from Galicia in the direction of Lublin, exercising their main pressure on the eastern portion of Russian Poland, while German forces in East Prussia were to hold out a hand to their allies across the Naru. It was a largely conceived fine plan, but in the existing situation it produced grave embarrassments. It did not take account of the fact that Austria-Hungary had sent a large army to the Serbian frontier, that 800,000 Russians had been sent against East Prussia, least of all that it had been betrayed with all its details to the Russian General Staff in peacetime. The Austro-Hungarian army, after making a hazardous attack on superior Russian forces, was now involved in critical frontal battles, while at the moment we were not in a position to render any direct assistance, though we were holding up large hostile forces. Our allies had to try and hold on until we had beaten Rennenkampf too. Only then could we come to their help, if not in full strength, at least with our main forces. As is known, Rennenkampf was then on the Daima-Allenburg-Gerdau-Angerburg line. We did not know what the enemy had by way of secrets in the region southeast of the Masurian lakes. The district of Grajevo was suspicious in any case. A good deal of movement was on foot there. Even more suspicious was the whole area behind the Niemann army. In that quarter there was a continuous movement of trains and marching columns. Apparently that movement was to the west and southwest. Rennenkampf had doubtless received reinforcements. The Russian reserve divisions from the interior were now ready to take the field. Perhaps all that had hitherto been available were single corps, which the Russian High Command believed they no longer needed against the Austrians in Poland. Would these units be sent to Rennenkampf or brought up near him, either to give him direct support or to strike at us from some unsuspected quarter? So far as we could judge, Rennenkampf had more than 20 divisions, yet he stood still and remained thus while our army came up from the west and deployed for battle against him. Why did he not use the time of our greatest weakness, when the troops were exhausted and crowded together on the battlefield of Tannenberg, to fall upon us? Why did he give us time to disentangle our units, concentrate afresh, rest, and bring up reinforcements? The Russian leader was known to be a fine soldier and general. When Russia was fighting in Eastern Asia among all the Russian leaders, it was the name of Rennenkampf that rang out over the world. Had his fame then been exaggerated, or had the general lost his military qualities in the meantime? Many a time has the soldier's calling exhausted strong characters, and that surprisingly quickly. The fine intellect and resolute will of one year give place to the sterile imaginings and faint heart of the next. That is perhaps the tragedy of military greatness. We have opened and closed the book of Rennenkampf's responsibility for Tannenberg. Let us now go in thought to his headquarters at Insterburg, not to blame him but to try and understand him. The disaster to Samsonov showed General Rennenkampf that the main body of our 8th Army was not in Königsberg, as he supposed. but he nonetheless suspected that we still had strong forces in that powerful fortress. It thus seemed venturesome, too venturesome, to mask it and throw himself upon the victorious German army in the neighborhood of Allenstein. It would be safer to hold on in the strong defensive positions between the Kurisches Half and the Masurian lakes. Against these lines, the Germans could certainly not try their art of envelopment from the north, and only with much difficulty from the south. If they made a frontal attack, he would fall upon their troops, crowded together, with strong forces held back in reserve. If they ventured on the improbable and pressed forward through the defiles between the lakes, it would be possible to attack the left flank of their enveloping columns from the north, while a newly formed group was hurled at their right flank and rear from the direction of Grajewo. If all else failed, well and good, he could withdraw into Russia. Russia was large, and the fortified line of the Niemen was at hand. Rennenkampf was no longer chained to East Prussia by any strategic necessity. The plan of joint operations with Samsonov had been brought to naught, and as the army of the latter had gone to its doom, even as it pressed hopefully forward, the best course was now to be cautious. Thus must Rennenkampf have reasoned, and critics have maintained that such was his reasoning. It must be admitted that no great decision could have been born of such thoughts. They did not exactly move on bold lines, yet their translation into action could have produced many a considerable direct crisis for us, and had a grave influence on the general situation in the East. The great numerical superiority of the Niemen army would have been quite enough to cut our Eighth Army to pieces, even after it had been reinforced. A premature retreat of Rennenkampf, however, would have robbed us of the fruits of our new operation, and thereupon made it impossible for us to advance on Warsaw, and thereby support the Austrians for a long time to come. We had therefore to be at once cautious and bold. It was this dual requirement which gave their peculiar character to the movements we now initiated. We first established our front on a broad arc from Willenberg to the outskirts of Königsberg. This took us until September 5th, broadly speaking. Then our line moved forward. 4 corps, the 20th, 11th, 1st Reserve, and Guard Reserve, and the troops from Königsberg, comparatively a strong force, advanced against the enemy's front on the Angerburg-Daima line. 2 corps, the 1st and 17th, were to push through the lake region. The 3rd Reserve Division, as the right echelon of our enveloping wing, had to follow south of the Masurian lakes, while the 1st and 8th Cavalry Divisions had to be held in readiness behind the main columns, to range at large as soon as the lake defiles were forced. Such were the forces against Rennenkampf's flank. So the scheme differed from the movements which had led to the victory of Tannenberg. This grouping of our columns was imposed upon us by the necessity of securing ourselves against Rennenkampf's strong reserves. In this way, 14 infantry divisions were told off to attack the front, in spite of the fact that its breadth was more than 95 miles. On the 6th and 7th, we were approaching the Russian lines and began to see rather more clearly. There were strong Russian columns near Insterburg and Wielau, perhaps even stronger ones north of Nordenburg. They made no movement at first, and in no way interfered with us as we deployed for battle before their lines. The 2 corps on our right, 1st and 17th, began to force their way through the chain of lakes on September 7th, while at Biala, the 3rd Reserve Division shattered half of the Russian 20th Corps in a brilliant action. We were entering upon the crisis of our new operations. The next few days would show whether Rennenkampf intended to attempt a counterattack, and whether his resolution to do so was as great as his resources. To add to his already formidable superiority, 3 more reserve divisions appeared to have reached the battlefield. Was the Russian commander still waiting for more? Russia had more than 3 million fighting men on her western front, while the Austro-Hungarian armies and ourselves had scarcely a third of that number. The battle blazed up along the whole front on September 8th. Our frontal attack made no progress, but things went better on our right wing. In that quarter, 2 corps had broken through the enemy's lake defenses and were turning north and northeast. Our objective was now the enemy's line of communications. Our cavalry appeared to have an open road in that direction. On the 9th, the battle raged further. On the front from Angerburg to the Kurischen Haff, it had no appreciable result, but our bold thrust east of the lakes made headway, although the two cavalry divisions were not able to break down the unexpected resistance they encountered with the speed we could have wished. The 3rd Reserve Division defeated an enemy several times its own strength at Lick and thus freed us once and for all from danger in the south. How were things going in the north? Our airmen believed they could now clearly identify 2 enemy corps at and west of Insterburg, as well as see another marching on Tilsit. What would be the fate of our corps, strung out fighting on a long front if a Russian avalanche of more than 100 battalions, led by resolute wills, descended upon them? Yet it is easy to understand what our wishes and words were on the evening of this September 9th. Rennenkampf, come what may, do not abandon this front of yours, we cannot force. Win your laurels with the attack of your center. We had now full confidence that by resolutely pressing home our attack on the wing, we could snatch back such laurels from the Russian leader. Unfortunately, the Russian commander knew what we were thinking. He had not sufficient determination to meet our plans with force, and lowered his arms. In the night of September 9 to 10, our patrols entered the enemy's trenches near Gerdauen and found them empty. The enemy is retreating. The report seemed to us incredible. The 1st Reserve Corps immediately pressed forward against Insterburg from Gerdauen. We urged caution. It was only about midday of the 10th that we were compelled to accept the improbable and unpalatable fact. The enemy had actually begun a general retreat, even though he offered a stout resistance here and there, and indeed threw heavy columns against us in disconnected attacks. It was now our business to draw the corps and cavalry divisions on our right wing sharply northeast, and set them at the enemy's communications with Insterburg and Kovno. On we pressed. If ever impatience was comprehensible, it was comprehensible now. Rennenkampf was retiring steadily. He too seemed to be impatient. Yet our impatience was in striving for victory, while his brought him confusion and dissolution. Some of the corps of the Niemann army were marching back into Russia in 3 columns very close together. The movement was effected but slowly, as it had to be covered by strong rearguards which kept back the Germans who were following up hard. September 11th in particular was a day of bloody fighting from Goldap right to the Pregel. In the evening of that day it was quite clear to us that only a few days more remained for us to carry out the pursuit. The development of the general situation in the Eastern Theater was having its effect. We suspected, rather than gathered from the definite reports which reached us, that the operations of our allies in Poland and Galicia had failed. In any case, it was no good thinking of our thrust across the Niemen in Rennenkampf's rear. But if our operation at the last moment was not to prove a failure within the framework of the whole Allied plan, the enemy's army must at least reach the protection of the Niemen sector so weakened and shaken that the bulk of our troops could be released for that cooperation with the Austro-Hungarian army which had become urgently necessary. On September 18th, the 3rd Reserve Division reached Suwałki on Russian soil. Rennenkampf's southern wing escaped envelopment by our 1st Corps south of Stalaponen by the skin of its teeth. Brilliant were the feats of several of our units engaged in the pursuit. They marched and fought and marched again until the men were dropping down from fatigue. On the other hand, it was on this day that we were able to withdraw the Guard Reserve Corps from the battlefront and hold it ready for further operations. It was on this day that our headquarters reached Insterburg, which had been in German occupation once more since the 11th. Moving on the broad East Prussian roads past our victorious columns marching eastwards and other columns of Russian prisoners streaming west, we thus reached Rennenkampf's former headquarters, not only in imagination, but in actual fact. This first evacuation had left behind remarkable traces of Russian semi-civilization. The heady odors of scent, leather, and cigarettes were not able to cover the odor of other things. Exactly a year later, I was returning through Insterburg after a day's hunting on a certain Sunday. At the marketplace, my car was turned back, as there was about to be a service of thanks to commemorate the release of the town from the Russian grip. I had to make a detour. I had not been recognized. Sic transit Gloria Mundi. On September 10th, our troops reached Idkunen, firing in the back of the Russian horde fleeing before them. Our artillery blew great gaps in the tightly packed masses, but the herding instinct filled them up again. Unfortunately, we did not reach the great main road from Werballen to Wilkowiski this day. The enemy knew that this would spell annihilation to many of his columns, which nothing now could stop. He therefore scraped together everything he had in the way of battle-worthy units, and threw them against our exhausted troops south of the road. We had only 1 day more for the pursuit. By the next Rennenkampf's forces would have taken refuge in that region of forest and marsh which lies west of the Olita-Kovno-Wileni sector of the Niemen. We should not be able to follow them there. On September 15th, the fighting was over. After a pursuit of more than 60 miles, a distance we had covered within 4 days, the Battle of the Masurian Lakes had ended on Russian soil. When the fighting concluded, the bulk of our units were fit for fresh employment elsewhere. I have no room here to speak of the brilliant exploit performed during these days by von der Goltz's Landwehr division and other Landwehr formations in their battles with enemy forces, many times their own strength in the region of our southern frontier, and while covering our right flank almost as far as the Vistula. By the time these actions were concluded, my command of the 8th Army had come to an end. At that point, our troops had pressed forward to Siekanov, Prasness, and Augustovo.
This concludes today's reading of Out of My Life, by Marshal Paul von Hindenburg. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent chapter, or download the entire audiobook from our webshop at intonio.net. Thank you for listening, and so long.